The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio. Where faith comes to life.
Welcome along to The Profile with me, Justin Brierley, a special podcast-only edition of the programme this week because of our special fundraising appeal over on Premier Christian Radio. If you do want to join in with that, we could really value your input on that. Do feel free to check out the website at premierchristianradio.com where you can find out more. But we never want to leave you lacking when it comes to the Profile podcast. And so I'm very pleased to say that on today's edition of the programme, I'm joined by Will Vander Hart. And of course, we're doing this all remotely from home and everything else because of the coronavirus. So that's certainly going to be a big part of our conversation today. Just a reminder, though, before I introduce Will, that if you want a free sample copy of Premier Christianity magazine, you can get hold of one. They're still going out despite coronavirus. You can ask for one at their website, premierchristianity.com/free sample. Wonderful monthly resource. And of course, The Profile is brought to you in partnership with Premier Christianity. Well, Will Vander Hart is a pastoral chaplain at Holy Trinity Brompton in London. He's also one of the founders of the Mind and Soul Foundation. And as someone who has himself been familiar with depression, mental health challenges, and so on, he's been seeking to help other Christians and churches to understand and care for those with mental health issues. His most recent book is The Power of Belonging, Discovering the Confidence to Lead with Vulnerability, written with Rob Waller. Will, welcome along to the programme. Great to have you with me.
Thanks so much, Justin. It's great to be here. It's lovely to have this opportunity to talk with you.
Well, this is the wonders of modern technology. Even though we're all in lockdown mode at the moment, we're still able to connect. Tell us, what is life like for you just at the moment, obviously with all these new restrictions in terms of, are you basically contained in the house and so on?
Yes, we are. We've actually done quite a long time quarantine because my son has some vulnerabilities health-wise. And so we've actually been in sort of family lockdown for about 9 days now. And we're actually also in with my parents-in-law who are over 70 and also have vulnerabilities. So we've got quite a strict regime here, and we are doing pretty well. We're in my parents-in-law's home, which is a little bit further out of London, and so we've got a little bit more space from where we actually live in the centre of London. So that's been good, but it's obviously very challenging. And we're homeschooling 3 children, and doing the sort of all the family shopping in one go as far as I can safely. But yeah, apart from that, both of us trying to do full-time jobs and look after the family at the same time. So it's challenging. I mean,
everyone is in the same boat here, aren't they? Everyone is facing unique challenges that they weren't even thinking about 2 weeks ago. And obviously for you guys, it's that much more strenuous because of the challenges of making sure you're shielding people who are especially vulnerable. I mean, let's be honest. I'm sure there are good parts and also really stressful moments as well, because everyone's kind of trying to deal with these new schedules and routines, which have kind of upended their normal life.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've really noticed in myself is how scheduled my life was before coronavirus. And I think for everyone who struggles a little bit with their emotional and mental health, tight regime, a very heavy schedule of life helps you to feel comfortable and generally does edit out quite a lot of the challenges you face. And, we do a lot of coaching with people around the idea of knowing what you're doing, having a really healthy pattern to life, having the right variation of spending time with people and then spending time alone. And here it seems all of those ground rules are kind of blown out of the water because, for us as a family, we're suddenly, all of us, 7 of us really tightly packed all together all the time. And then you can't go out and do these other things, and it's very hard to get alone time. So a lot of the general well-being advice that we would give people is, has to be reworked in this season. But there also is something quite powerful in this idea of actually finding sort of solitude or separation from the previous schedule of life. And I've realized how much distraction technique I've used, not just working and family life, but also Netflix and all these other things which aren't available to where we are right now, and actually just having a little bit more quiet time, which can be a little bit terrifying, but equally I think it's actually probably pretty good for me too.
Yeah, well, we'll maybe talk about how to deal with cabin fever a bit later on when it comes to living at close quarters with people that you weren't necessarily always so used to spending so much time around. But let's go back to your early life, Will. Was Christianity kind of part of your life growing up, and what eventually led you into a kind of call to ministry?
Well, I did grow up in a Christian family. My parents are Christians, and I grew up in a free evangelical church, which was a wonderful place to begin life in faith. I definitely made a commitment to Christ as quite a young child. I think our experience of faith was probably quite severe on one level. Maybe it's quite typical for that kind of period of faith, and so I didn't always feel secure talking about the sort of emotional stuff, which I talk about today. And I certainly was quite a worried child. And so a lot of my prayer life, I look back and realize a lot of my prayer life was dominated by anxiety. Wow. I'm not sure how much of it was actually prayer and how much of it was actually just sort of worrying to God. I found I kind of wandered away from my faith, I think, as an older teen and then as a student, partly because I think this sort of escapism into drinking and socializing was a way of escaping from a lot of the anxiety which had been sort of undealt with, really, in my childhood. And so it wasn't actually until later on I reconciled faith, came into a really living relationship with Jesus, and also realized that God wasn't saying to me I shouldn't feel this or I shouldn't feel that or I shouldn't experience this or I shouldn't experience that, but actually he was saying I'm with you in the storm. And my presence is a comfort, not a condemnation. I think one of the things I kind of learned to believe, and I don't think my pastor growing up had ever intended this, but I think I'd kind of come to believe that I needed to always be joyful, and everything needed to always be okay. And if I was feeling low or if I was feeling worried, I was being disobedient to God, and I wasn't really living my Christian life. And I found that the weight of expectation quite hard to deal with.
Yeah, I can imagine that's the story for many other people as well, that it is possible to grow up in certain kind of Christian environments where you constantly have to be living in the victory, and if you're not, then something's desperately wrong. But that doesn't take into account the fact that we are human, and that frankly we will all go through seasons where we don't feel the same as we did yesterday necessarily. Do you think generally churches are more aware of that kind of pressure that can be put on Christians that isn't always very helpful?
Absolutely. I mean, when we started Mind and Soul Foundation in 2005, I think there was still quite a strong dogma around emotional health, and that was largely, I mean, let's be honest, it was well-meaning, but it wasn't necessarily well thought through. I don't think any church leader has any intention to kind of create emotional challenges for their congregations, but I think we'd made assumptions around emotional mental health that just weren't actually true. And the biggest assumption, I think, has always been that we have absolute agency in the work of our minds, and obviously we all accept that our bodies can give up. No one they don't manifest the flu because they've worked it upon themselves. They either get it or they don't. But we'd made assumptions around mental health that actually it was on us. So depression became sort of laziness or a lack of gratitude, it's our responsibility. Anxiety became a lack of deciding to trust and almost kind of mollycoddling ourselves and making ourselves kind of the center of attention. Personality disorders were just bad behavior. Psychotic disorders were largely around sort of demonic manifestation. Maybe you've been involved in some occult practices or something in the past. So all of the narrative around mental health was about personal agency. This is your fault, and you've got to do something about it. And I think, unfortunately, that isn't true. I mean, in some ways, it would be much easier if it was true, because we'd be able to solve these problems behaviorally. Behavior does benefit our psychology. We use a technique called cognitive behavioral therapy, which is about changing your thoughts to change your behavior, which does change your mood. But actually, that's a kind of medicine, and the origins of our mental ill health are largely neurochemical and don't have massive amounts of personal agency. So no one personally gets a serious enduring mental health problem. And people who are seriously depressed aren't lazy, and people who are anxious are not overly fearful. So that was the kind of the locus of misunderstandings been around personal agency. and this sense that we are greater agents in our mental health than we really are.
Yeah, I think more and more churches especially are beginning to better understand now the issues there that we have to treat often mental health issues sort of in a similar way that you would treat someone with a broken leg. There is often a physical component to that. That doesn't mean it's their fault specifically, that or whatever, and being more pastorally sensitive, let's say, to the way we encourage and pastor people who are going through mental health issues. But just to come back to your story, Will, so I guess at some point along the journey, you felt a call to ministry yourself. I mean, were you aware at that point that it would involve ministering specifically in the area of mental health?
No, and I think, Justin, probably like many people in my area of work, I had no interest really in getting involved in mental. If you said to me at 19, you're going to be a priest in the area of mental and emotional health, I probably would run a mile, if I'm honest. Actually, I was really into sports, and I wanted to become a sports pastor, and I was an evangelist. And when I was training, I felt called to ministry because I was teaching and I was doing a lot of chaplaincy work, which I loved. And I think that's probably because I'm a pastor at heart, so the chaplaincy side really appealed to me. I felt called to ministry, and I got involved. And then I went to theological college, and it was there really that I was traveling along at high speed, very full, great agenda, playing lots of sports, doing lots of evangelistic sort of work. And I had a view that that's what I was going to be doing in the future. It was probably during my university time as a postgraduate that I started to experience some emotional health challenges, and mine have always orientated themselves around anxiety. So whilst I had a low level of anxiety, it became slightly more acute in my training period. And I found worry dominating my worldview a lot more significantly. And then when I began my curacy in London, that's when my anxiety basically became very acute. And that was the first time I'd say that I suddenly realised I had a mental health problem. And that was following the London bombings in 2005, where I effectively had an experience of what was sort of post-traumatic stress. Just
tell us about that a little bit, because what was your involvement at that time? This is obviously the tube and public transport bombings that took place in 2005. I think it was July, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
And so what was your involvement there? And how did that manifest subsequently?
So my wife, Louie, was going to the tube. She was actually going to Paddington Station. We lived by Edgware Road Station, and I walked her to Paddington. She was going to a conference in Oxford for the day, and I walked back probably about 9:10, so just after the bombs had gone off at Edgware Road Station. And as the priest locally, I had a parish hall right opposite the station, and there were just a couple of policemen there at the time. I went under the first cordon and offered them use of this church hall. And I didn't. They told me there'd been an electrical incident on the line, and I said, "Oh, do you want to use my hall for toilets? And do you want to base yourself there?" Anyway, they loved that idea, so I opened up the hall. Anyway, within about an hour, you can imagine, suddenly we were this sort of operational base for the Edgware Road incident, and I was, I guess, a sort of pseudo chaplain on site. I felt pretty useless, to be honest, but I was sort of clucking around like mother hen, providing coffee and tea and toilets and prayer and everything. But I think what happened to me during the day, I mean, I was there very intensely through the first most intense period, and we also saw the Russell Square bomb go off on the small TV monitor with the fire service personnel. So I was basically traumatized. In this, I saw some things that were probably not that helpful for me to see. I breathed a lot of secondhand smoke on the experience. I was sick just through the amount of adrenaline I was experiencing, basically. And that traumatic experience, I didn't know it at the time, but that really opened the lid on my anxiety problem. And I'd say I had a very unsettled summer following the 7/7 bombings. And when I came back into London after our family holiday, I think the proximity to the tube, all the sort of memories, all of the kind of visceral anxiety really flooded over me, and I had what I call it an anxiety breakdown. Effectively, started having multiple panic attacks, wasn't able to sleep, I lost my appetite, I spiraled into a kind of depression, became really quite unwell. And at that time, the church, I was leading, I was a curate in a big charismatic evangelical church. And we didn't really have a framework for mental health. We had 1,000 or so members, But one of my dear colleagues, he said I was just tired. So his perspective on mental health was that, this was physical exhaustion. And my other colleague sweetly believed that somehow the devil was assailing me, which actually made me really anxious, because then I thought, goodness, now I've got a real problem. So if you like, the two polarities of our church perspective, either sort of denying that mental health is a reality or over-spiritualizing it, were both real. It was actually my non-Christian GP who really saved me, and would call me up out of hours to check that I was doing okay, and I needed medication, I needed therapy, and I made a really pretty strong recovery. I was left with a diagnosis of what's called GAD, which is generalized anxiety disorder, which doesn't really go off of your file, if you like. I still carry that diagnosis, but I haven't had any of those struggles, if you like, for the last sort of 14 years. Well, what is apparent, though, is that people like me talking about these sort of stories is risky, in that people who are listening could think that the London bombings is the reason that I had an acute anxiety episode, whereas I'd say the London bombings were the straw that broke the camel's back, if you like. But I already had anxiety issues before the London bombings. And again, a kind of natural Christian modus operandi is to try and legitimize your mental health problem, and to say, well, I did this important thing and then I got ill as a consequence, but actually I was unwell beforehand. It just was very low level anxiety and hadn't been addressed. And so this trauma actually kind of blew the lid off what I'd been trying to hide. At that point, I mean, who knew what to do? And that's the point at which I thought, if I'm experiencing quite a high level of unintended stigma, then I kept thinking about all the people in my congregation who must have mental health issues, of which I knew none. So I was 1,000 people, but I had not come across a single mental health problem.
Wow.
And it wasn't until I started talking about it in my church that people started coming forward in droves.
Premier Christianity Magazine.
Are you fed up with fake news or bored of bad stories? We think it's time for something different. I'm Sam Hales, editor of Premier Christianity Magazine. Every month, our team publishes stories of lives transformed, testimonies, miracles, healings, and loads more good news. We're here to encourage you, excite you, and keep you up to date with all that God is doing through His church. That's why we're proud to bring you a magazine that's different.
For your free copy, visit premierchristianity.com/free sample.
It feels like you were really ahead of the curve, because nowadays, we've really have been made much more aware of mental health issues, and major people, well, I don't know if I can call him Prince Harry anymore, but Harry and Bill and everyone have, obviously been themselves spokespeople on that front. And we see a lot more people being very open about it in the media and everything else, and just a lot more resources. But I mean, back when you were beginning things like the Mind and Soul Foundation, as you say, most people very uneducated, actually, or simply ignorant in a way of what is really constituted by most mental health issues. And so in a way, I see you as having been very much a pioneer at the vanguard of helping, especially the church, obviously, to start to recognize and deal more helpfully with some of these issues. So how did that all start for you when you started to realize this was an area of ministry that you were being called to?
Well, Justin, you make me sound rather grand. I think I'm a reluctant disciple, and I think when you go through something like this, in a way, the last thing you want to do is then sort of tell everyone, because the culture is quite stigmatizing still. And I had really lovely clergy friends calling me up, some advising me to keep quiet about it because it would damage my professional career, and some others, sort of wanting to trying to understand it and really struggling. I think I came to a position on it where I thought, I'm either going to live my life trying to hide this vulnerability, which is not helping me, or I'm going to let God to use this brokenness to make something better. And I kept coming across Paul's teaching around, when I'm weak, he is strong, and, we're broken vessels being made perfect in his image, that kind of idea about God redeeming us out of ashes. And I really did at the time feel like I was in ashes. And so I made a very conscious decision to decide to talk about mental health. Unfortunately, I had a really dear friend from my university at Cambridge, Dr. Rob Waller, who's a consultant psychiatrist. And Rob had been speaking a lot about mental health and spirituality to the NHS. And he helped me in my recovery. And I said, look, why don't we join together? I'll start talking to the church about mental health, and you carry on talking to the NHS about spirituality. And so that's how the partnership began. And we just started blogging online. I mean, it was like two funny chaps in a garage, kind of logging on a chat room, sort of talking about our experiences. But what was amazing at the time, this is now 15 years ago, is that our sort of web blogs exploded in terms of the amount of people that were accessing it. And that would turn into hundreds of thousands, which now doesn't sound like very many, but at the time it was a lot.
Yeah.
Now I think we get about 4.5 million hits a year from 26 different countries. And so that conversation has definitely rapidly spiraled. But what's good now is not just us. There's a whole plethora of great organizations doing this kind of work. But when we started, it was a case of beginning a conversation about spirituality and mental health. And I guess I started by simple things like looking at the emotions of Jesus. I kept thinking that I think sort of everyone had this idea that Jesus was sort of floating a sort of 3/4 of an inch above the floor, smiling throughout his ministry. And that we had this idea that Jesus' experiences emotionally were just peace and like serenity. And then I started looking at the Bible in a new way, and Jesus is weeping at the death of Lazarus, and Jesus is like sweating drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's like kind of this emotional distress, and Jesus is really furious. He's whipping people out of the temple courts. It's like this is sort of anger that is just phenomenal and inexplicable. And I started looking at the sort of this other side of Jesus' emotion, and how whole Jesus was emotionally, and started thinking whether or not we as Christians had cut our emotions off at the knees, and there were lots of emotions that weren't, if you like, deemed appropriate for us. I mean, like being angry. It's just in your anger, do not sin. It doesn't say do not be angry. Sadness, like grieving. I mean, the books of Lamentations are in the Bible because grieving is significant, and yet no one seems to be talking about grief. Emotions that are common to us all. I mean, Elijah is suicidal in Kings, saying, "Take my life, Lord. I'm no better than my ancestors." And you look at these characters and you suddenly think the Bible is full of emotion, and yet we are only allowed to live in this tiny box of emotion, and that's creating problems for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the title of your latest book, as I mentioned, is about the power of belonging and discovering the confidence to lead with vulnerability. And I think what you were just saying earlier, many people feel the same, many Christian leaders especially. I'm not allowed to appear vulnerable because I'm the person everyone looks to as the rock, the solid foundation, leading everyone forward as though I know exactly what I'm doing. And obviously, beneath the sea, behind the scenes, it's never like that in most leaders' lives. They're just as vulnerable as anyone else to feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and so on, and depression, of course. And of course, there have been some very high-profile cases, very sad cases, just in the last 12 months or so. I'm especially thinking of was it Jared Wilson in California and so on. Who himself was running a mental health sort of charity, Christian charity, and very sadly took his own life. And those kinds of stories bring home the fact that leaders are not in some sense immune. And I don't know, what have you felt about some of those major high profile stories and what they brought home to us about the reality of mental health issues, especially for leaders as well?
There's a real danger, isn't there, in triumphalism in terms of how we live. We're in this weird kingdom of the now and the not yet. And I think we're struggling intense longing for this heavenly home. And I think that encouragement is to live in our reality with this hopeful kingdom view. As long as we're denying our emotional reality, I think we're in danger. And the power of belonging is about saying, actually, we can live not just well, but better by living authentically. And we're not called to kind of hide. So many leaders, I mean, I coach a lot of leaders around emotional health and well-being, and so many leaders are struggling with depression and anxiety particularly, and that's a high diagnosis nationally, 6.1%. is the kind of diagnosis for anxiety, mixed anxiety and depression. But I'd say in terms of leaders of churches, I wouldn't be surprised if 50% were struggling in a way with anxiety and depression. Obviously, many on an undiagnosed level, but the pressures are so incredibly high. The emotional burdens are so incredibly intense. The level of expectation is off the charts. Leaders are also struggling with loneliness because they don't believe that they can necessarily share those burdens. And so the nature of ministry itself, particularly 21st century ministry, which is a lot faster and the expectations are a lot higher than they maybe were even 50 years ago in this country, the leaders are struggling with their emotional health. And so, having a more authentic way of being and actually accepting our vulnerability can transform our leadership. I also believe that people, congregant members, connect with us in our vulnerabilities, not in our strengths. That actually, when we lead with a kind of bravado, in a kind of gung-ho way, as if everything's great, the congregation retract and they actually hide their real experiences in order that they might seem online, if you like, with what we are expressing. And so we're actually suppressing their spiritual reality, when actually what we want to do is invite God into that mess and enable them to get the help that he longs to give them. So there's a knock-on, not just for leaders, but also for congregation members.
Yeah, it's huge. And I can imagine, we've already seen the way that, the studies and statistics tell us the way that social media, while it's great at one level, is also kind of feeding to some extent the anxiety and mental health issues in many people. And that, of course, applies to leaders because there's always that sense of, look at what that other person's doing, all that they're achieving, their amazing ministry, their amazing perfect family. And none of that looks like that for me. So I can imagine that all of those kind of new pressures that exist for leaders today take their toll emotionally and psychologically.
I mean, we're seeing that in spades right now. And I'm not sure if you've been on your newsfeed recently, but there's sort of literally 100 different preachers and pastors all teaching to me through my Facebook and Instagram and Twitter feeds. And leaders are going through a revolution right now where they've closed their churches and they're having to do everything online. I was chatting to a leader today and they were just remarking on the anxiety that creates, not just the workload, but also the anxiety that suddenly, your congregation is dissipated and then suddenly they're in this incredible spiritual marketplace. What does that mean for your congregation and how do you lead them effectively? So leaders are exposed on so many levels right now and feeling so much pressure and also burden for the care of their communities and those who are sick as well. So, I think, I encourage everyone to pray for their leaders, pray for us. We need your prayer. But also we have to exercise discipline in our leadership. And, I always said that, if the devil can't stop you from doing what he doesn't want you to do, he'll get you to do too much of it. Now, the danger is often that the devil might oppose your calling, but if you can't stop your calling, he'll give way to such an extent you'll kill yourself in terms of your workload. And I see, unfortunately, that spirit of competition overwhelms us, and leaders are burning out because effectively they're doing too much of what the devil doesn't want them to do. And disciplines of self-care are not just personal disciplines, they're spiritual disciplines. I love the fact that Jesus in Mark's gospel, he's at Simon Peter's mother's house. It says the whole village came to be healed by him. But rather than hanging around to heal the whole village, it says very early in the morning, whilst it was still dark, Jesus left the house and went up the mountain to pray. Now, what we know about the story is that no one knew where Jesus was, because it says later the disciples were looking for him. And then they said, Jesus, where were you? Everyone's looking for you. So what we know is that at some point early in the morning, whilst it was still dark, Jesus tiptoed probably over the broken and bruised bodies of the people who are still waiting to be healed and went up the mountain to actually spend time attending to his emotional and mental health by praying to God the Father. It's like the lost sheep to the good shepherd.
These sorts of practices have come to be placed under a new term these days, mindfulness. But in a way, it's not new. This has been part of the Christian tradition for millennia. But I think in a way, we're being called in our modern world to rediscover some of those ancient practices, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. And mindfulness practice, it's not Buddhist practice, which lots of Christians are worried about. It's actually what it is to be human. The nature of being human is the awareness of your own consciousness. You're aware that you're conscious. Effectively, that's what mindfulness practice is. And mindfulness practice is about holding on to something that might be distressing you and not suppressing it or repressing it or denying it, but then attending to other things in your environment. So, this sort of sense of, like, for example, with this, COVID virus, the temptation is to be on the news feeds constantly consuming content because you want to fix the problem. You want to find out that bit of news that's going to save you. But actually, mindfulness practice is to hold on to your anxiety, not to push it away or deny it, but to hold on to it, but then to give attention to the birds in your garden, or the children in your homeschool, or, whatever project you happen to be doing online. So mindfulness is good because it helps us to hold on to the unanswered questions and not try and be in the position of power. You could say it's about restoring the principle of life, that God is God and we are we. So mindfulness practice is about not allowing yourself to be activated by all of the desires and pressures of life, and instead to put your attention to those things which you want to give to your attention. And for me, and for all of us as Christians, a lot of that should be about giving our attention back to God and not letting, like, the experiences of the world overwhelm our attention.
Yeah. So just at this present time, when we are facing unique challenges, many people, as you say, their schedules have been interrupted, their life is kind of been put on pause in many ways, and they're not able to do lots of the things they maybe were once able to do that have helped them, when it comes to mental health issues. What would be your, if there were three kind of key tips, let's say, and I know you've been sharing some brilliant articles over at the Mind and Soul Foundation website as well along these lines, but maybe three key things that someone who is feeling a sort of a spike in their anxiety, is feeling fearful, is just aware that this whole situation is pulling them into a certain way of being, and they feel kind of a bit left out at sea. Where should they begin, especially if they're a Christian, when it comes to just starting to, look at that situation and find practical ways to deal with it?
The first thing to say is it's natural and normal to feel afraid. That actually God's created us with three physical systems: productivity, recovery, and security. And that your limbic system is going to be activated by this news because it's a threat. It's a threat to all of us. And so it's okay and normal and natural to feel fear. So don't try and push your fear away as if it's spiritually not appropriate. Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow, for today has got enough cares of its own. What he's saying is, attend to the fear of the day, but don't attend to the catastrophic fears of your mind, which are about things that haven't happened yet. So the first thing is to accept that fear is okay, and to recognize that you're going to be afraid. I think that three important things we can do. The first one is to recognize that whilst we are isolating, we don't need to get isolated. And for many people watching right now, listening right now, there might be a sense of, I'm all on my own. If you're a single person, if you're an older person on your own, that can be very terrifying. But what we want to is recognize that whilst you might be physically isolating, you don't need to be emotionally or spiritually isolated. And there are a number of things that you can do. Obviously, dial into media, but be careful not to dial into news media all the time. Phone friends, ask a friend to call, ask family to drop notes by, connect with friends on whatever service provider you use, but try and stay connected every day and make sure you have one or two meaningful conversations, but also try and make sure those conversations aren't totally dominated by this virus. Try and think and to talk about other things, and obviously reminisce about things that happen. If you've got a pet your pet. If you've got a window, put some birdseed on your window and just come and enjoy the birds. They'll keep you company. But the key thing is to recognize you might be isolating, but you don't need to be isolated. And the most important message there is that Jesus will never leave you, that you're never isolated from the presence of Jesus. And, in Psalm 139, it says, I go up to the heavens, but you are there. I go down into the depths of the sea, but you are there. Where can I flee from your presence? Where can I go from your presence? Everywhere your hand will guide me. So however isolated you might feel, be attentive to the reality of the presence of God that's with you, and don't allow yourself to be isolated when you're isolating. So that's the first thing, very important for your emotional well-being, to stay connected. The second thing, I think, is what we call gratitude training. Now, if you're anything like me, it's much easier at times like these to see the empty glass. Forget half empty; it's just completely dry right now. There's this terrifying virus. People are dying, and we are, as a nation and as a world, in desperate pain. But you can choose to let that dominate your event horizon entirely, in which case you will definitely feel emotionally more troubled. Or you can begin to explore with gratitude your immediate circumstances. So if you are well right now, a thing to give thanks to God for is that you have your health. And you can say, God, I'm just so thankful that I'm healthy right now. You know, if you're mildly unwell, you can say, thank you, God, that I've just got a mild illness right now. If you have got friends and family that can dial in on your phone or call you can say, thank God that I've got this media outlet. Thank God that I've got some toilet roll in my house. It might be small things, but what we know psychologically is that gratitude training actually changes your mood. And you can either allow yourself to edit out all of the positive thoughts, or you can allow yourself to edit them in. But that is a discipline. So my encouragement is to choose gratitude. Paul says, I found the secret of being thankful in all circumstances. And I think we have an opportunity. In the West, we rarely ever have this opportunity. But right now, we have the opportunity to put Paul's teaching into practice and say, how can I be grateful in this incredibly difficult circumstance? That's the second thing. I think the third thing is around catastrophizing. And for anxiety sufferers like me, we have a very heightened sense of self-preservation. And so what your anxiety system is typically trying to get you to do is to see further down the line, to look further down into the future, to work out what threat might be coming along on your event horizon. I'm sure many listeners, when you were a kid, you might have played those platform games in the arcade, and you're a fighter jet, and then things appear, and you have to sort of navigate them and shoot them down by the time they arrive at your top screen. If you're a good player, you can almost work out the pattern of when the big bomber is going to appear. And what we try and do as anxiety sufferers is sort of look beyond the immediate screen and envisage what might actually happen next. Now, that overthinking is what we call catastrophizing. And catastrophizing creates huge problems for us because effectively we're fighting battles that we're not even needing to fight. And we're stimulating adrenaline we don't need to use. And so I'd encourage you right now to, again, take Jesus' teaching in Matthew 6:34 to heart and say, actually, rather than worrying about tomorrow, that's, if you like, catastrophizing this problem, I'm going to deal with the immediate challenges of today. And again, this is hard, but actually it is a discipline. And if you find yourself tracking away into a catastrophic circumstance which hasn't happened yet, practice just bring yourself back into the moment. And I do that through the senses. So feel something. You might feel that your jeans, rub your hands on your jeans or on the table, feel the texture of that. Smell something. Smell the air. You'll be amazed what you smell when you actually try and smell the air. Smell your room. This room needs dusting. So smell something, feel something, hear something, listen into your immediate environment, try and tune in. So is it traffic, a train, children running in a garden next door? Hear something, and then know something. Know that God is with you in this very present moment. So try and use your senses to bring you back into the now, and your sensory presence will help you to change what you're thinking here about what might happen and keeping you rooted in the right now with Jesus, which is where you really need to be. So those are the three things I'd encourage you to do to actually know that you're isolating, but you're not alone, practice gratitude, and pull yourself back from catastrophizing.
Hugely, hugely helpful. Thank you so much, Will. Look, we've had a good amount of your time, and I know you've probably got lots of things to attend to. Before we go, though, would you just pray for anyone who is at this moment feeling anxious, who perhaps does have mental health issues that are being provoked, especially at this difficult time? It would be great for you to pray for us, if you would, Will.
Of course, I'll be delighted. Lord Jesus, we want to thank you that you know us. You know how our minds work, how our bodies work, how our emotions work. We want to thank you that you've promised never to leave us or forsake us. So right now, wherever we are, we invite your presence. Help us, Lord, in this divine interruption to become aware of your presence with us and your comfort for us. Help us to be kind and compassionate to ourselves and to those around us, and make us agents of your peace. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen. mindandsoulfoundation.org is the place to go if you want to find out more about Will and the amazing work that they do there. There's also, you're on Twitter as well, aren't you, of course? At Will van der Hart?
At Will van der Hart, but also at Mine and Soul UK on all of the social channels.
Brilliant. So look out for that. I'll make sure there are links from today's podcast as well. Thank you so much for being my guest on the podcast, on the Profile podcast today, Will. And if you want more from the Profile podcast, you can, of course, find us online over at premierchristianradio.com/the profile. And don't forget to get your free sample copy of Premier Christianity magazine as well. It's still going out, coronavirus or not. We're still pumping out the old magazine, and you can get the latest edition of the mag absolutely free. That's over at premierchristianity.com/free sample. For now, Will, thank you so much for your pastoral wisdom and just for your presence at a time like this. And I know many people are going to be blessed by what we've been able to share today.
Thanks so much, Justin.